Excellent. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Arini Allen, and I'm the director of the Institute for Classics Education. We're a 501c3 nonprofit in the United States, and our mission is simply to spread knowledge and engagement with the classics and to make the study of them available for anybody who's interested in learning about them. Today, I'm so happy to have Charles Baker with us. Charles is studying for a DPhil at the University of Oxford and previously taught Latin and Greek at a leading independent school in London. And his research focuses on the exegetical Scholia to the Iliad. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Charles.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. We tested this once and it worked. Let's hope we get lucky twice. Is that all working okay?
Works for me.
Great. So I'm going to talk for 45, 50 minutes, I hope. And then I will be more than happy to take questions. This talk started as an introductory lecturer for undergrads into the Scholia to the Iliad. So I hope that I will be able to offer you some interesting insights without getting too technical right from the get-go. So I want to use the Scholia today to give us some of these ancient insights. And in order to get there, I need to do a little bit of sort of preliminary business to give you a grounding in what we're looking at. So bear with me while I introduce you to one of the most fascinating corpuses of texts, corpora of texts, if you like, in the ancient world, which is the Scholia. First of all, what are they? Well, here is a screenshot of the Venetus A. It's a Byzantine manuscript. And the Scholia are all of this, and this, and also this, and also all of this. It is pretty much everything on the page. In fact, you can see in the full picture over on the left, it's everything that is not the darker main text. And I know what you're thinking. Based on that handwriting and the parchment, surely this is a manuscript from the 10th century AD. And you would be right. This is a Byzantine manuscript, so it is from the post-classical period. And so the first thing that I need to do is tell you how we get from antiquity, where the Scholia originate, to this form, which is how they survive for us. So I'm going to start with this timeline, which will take us from the beginning up to that manuscript. So the first step, I suppose, is Troy being destroyed in the whatever it was, the historical kernel that inspired the poems. The site that we think is the sort of historical Troy is known as Troy 7b, and it was destroyed maybe sometime, although it's controversial, around sort of 1200 BCE. A little later, again, there's a lot of debate, but I suppose most people would say sometime between 800 and 600 BCE, the Iliad, as we know it today, came into being and reached a form that is relatively familiar with us. Obviously, we could debate about that for ages. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with the questions about the dating of the Iliad, Homer versus Hesiod. And for our purposes today, I'm going to be focusing on the Iliad rather than the Odyssey. In my case, that's purely because I work on the Iliad Scholia, though there are also Odyssey Scholia. To keep things simple, we're going to stick to the Iliad. So the poem circulates at first orally, we presume, perhaps it was written. And I sort of want to skip ahead through the whole messy business of the 5th century BC in classical Athens and skip right ahead to the Library of Alexandria, the 3rd century, the 200s BC. And two key figures that are worth noting there are Zenodotus and Aristarchus. Both, Zenodotus was the earlier, both attempted to create a definitive text of the Iliad. And Aristarchus was, I suppose he remains, nobody else is coming along, the foremost Homer scholar in antiquity. He produced a very sophisticated set of critical symbols to annotate his text. He had a whole series of working methods, and he was somebody who evidently worked very closely with the text of Homer for much of his life. Um, his text, his preferred text, was taken up, worked, and reworked by his followers, although the main evidence for the text that he preferred to read is the Scholia, or one part of the Scholia. But funnily enough, most of the time, his preferred readings, where he offers variants, are not actually incorporated into the standard text that circulated in antiquity through the Byzantine period and right down to today. He often, in fact, wanted to remove lines he considered inappropriate, sort of not fitting for the dignity of Homer. But thankfully, when he considered a line inappropriate or not really Homer's or repeated from elsewhere, he would just mark the line in the margins and he wouldn't delete it completely. So those, thankfully, do still survive in papyri from the ancient world and in our texts today. The work of Zenodotus we know even less about than Aristarchus, because for the most part, the only time we know about a reading of Zenodotus is when he is quoted by Aristarchus, who will then go on to disagree with him and say why Zenodotus has got it wrong. Now, Aristarchus, as I said, he was sort of arguably the first systematic scholar of the Homeric epics, and there is an excellent book, The Best of the Grammarians by Francesca Schironi. If you'd like to learn more about that, I'll have a bibliography at the end of the presentation. She sort of convincingly argues that Aristarchus had a few, I think it's 4 or 5 key scholarly principles that motivated his approach to the text. One of those, for instance, was the idea that the world of the Homeric poems had to be consistent across the Iliad and the Odyssey, that is. And that might sound obvious to us, but using the consistency of the heroic world as depicted within these poems as a criterion for textual editing is really quite a remarkable step, and absolutely a firm vote of confidence in the poetry of Homer. He wasn't the last scholar of Homer, Aristarchus, and many others followed him in writing works dedicated to some part of the poem or writing longer commentaries. I'm not going to focus too much on the Aristarchan tradition today, but it's very important to note. We fast forward now to the 1st century AD. How we get from the 3rd century to the 1st century is the story of the rise of the Roman Republic and eventually the Empire. And in that period, one particularly important event is the expulsion of scholars by Ptolemy VIII from Alexandria. Which leads to a sort of scholarly diaspora leaving Alexandria and spreading around the Mediterranean. And in the same way that the sack of Constantinople centuries later would be a catalyst for new scholarly engagement in Western Europe, so too the sort of scholars being driven out of Alexandria and having to find their homes elsewhere on Cyprus, for instance, mainland Greece, even in Italy, led to the dissemination of Alexandrian knowledge and working much more widely. So by the time we get to the 1st century AD, Aristarchus's works, the sort of little signs in the margins of his Iliad texts, have been pretty widely distributed, and wealthy Romans, by this point, will have private libraries of Greek and Latin texts. You are probably all aware of the excitement at the moment about the Herculaneum scrolls, and us finally getting to decipher some of those texts. That is, of course, preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius in the 1st century AD. So it gives us a pretty good sense of what a wealthy book collector would be able to have in their home. By this point, also, education has become, in the Greek-speaking parts of the empire, pretty standardized. And that's in part thanks to the spread of Alexander the Great and his successors, spreading a sort of Greek as administrative language across large chunks of that bit of the world. So in the education system, children learn to read and write, first of all. Then they learn to engage with literature. And finally, only for wealthy boys, they would learn to become orators, and they would learn the techniques of rhetoric. Homer was very important throughout this process, in fact. Even at the very, very beginning, when boys are learning to read and write, where we find school texts, the names that they are learning to copy out to learn their alphabets are very often the names of Homeric characters. So this situation in the first century creates a demand for commentaries on Homer, the text of the Iliad, for for various reasons. Scholars will want a guide to Aristarchus's edition and previous scholars' work in that sort of mold. Educated non-scholars want commentaries explaining the finer literary points, perhaps with some of the scholarship as well. And those still learning the poem, children or adults, will need a companion that explains what's going on. For instance, some of the difficult Homeric Greek. It is worth sort of saying at this point, just to sort of plant the seed, that scholarship as a category is quite different, I think, in the ancient world than today. And things that we would think of as elementary or purely educational can crop up in surprising places. So, sort of leaving that question about who counts as a scholar and what counts as scholarship, we sort of move along from that sort of situation to the 2nd century AD, where we encounter a lovely standalone commentary, which is Oxyrhynchus Papyrus 221, now known as British Library Papyrus 1184. And this is the back of it, the verso. This is an example of a standalone commentary to Homer. It is commenting on Iliad Book 21. We have some pretty substantial fragments of it that survive. And like commentaries today, they start by quoting a little bit of the text to show what they're commenting on, and then they go on to do whatever it is that they're commenting on. So if we zoom in on this red bit in the red box, a little bit of context first. So this is the section of Iliad 21 that this particular bit is commenting on. This is Poseidon speaking to Achilles when Achilles is worried that he is going to be defeated in battle by the river and drowned. And Poseidon says, "Son of Peleus, do not tremble overmuch, nor be troubled at all. For such helpers are we too of the gods, with Zeus's approval, I and Pallas Athene. So it is not your fate to be vanquished by a river, but this one shall soon abate, and you yourself shall know it. But we shall advise you shrewdly if you should obey." And in the Greek, I've bolded 2 key words here: potamoige, by the river, and lawfare, he shall abate. He shall leave off, he shall cease. So if I return to the image of the papyrus, now zoomed in, any of you who are familiar with the Greek alphabet, you may be able to pick out what this comment says. It's split across 2 lines. It looks like this. It's potamoige, which is the quote from the text, and then the comment is hupotu potamu. Those of you familiar with Greek grammar, again, will know that potamoige, by the river, is constructed as a dative of instrument, dative of agent, which is fine in Homer, but in later Greek, in classical Attic Greek, for instance, instead you would use the preposition hupo, as here, and then the genitive case, to potamu. So what has happened here is the commentary is telling us that potamoige, in the Homeric text, what that means in standard Greek is hupo to potamu, by the river. Translates to the same thing in English. A much longer comment that I want to show you is here. I'm not going to make you all read this off the papyrus. I've got the transcription for you on the next slide. So this is quoting that verb lawfare, he shall abate. And it does a couple of things here. So it first of all gives us, a bit like the previous comment, a one-word gloss. He shall give in, endorse. And then it gives us a little etymological note. And I won't spend too long on this, but it makes a connection between this word lophus, the withers, the sort of top of an animal's neck. It sort of notices, if you like, that that sounds familiar to lawfare, that loth and lorth connection at the start of the word, and says that, well, this is sort of where that verb comes from, and constructs an etymology out of that. Because lophus can mean the withers, and then it glosses its own word. It glosses withers as trachelus, neck. It comes from animals putting their necks under the yoke. Therefore, as an animal stops struggling when it goes under the yoke and is bound to it, in the same way, this verb sort of plays on that to mean that the river will abate. And then it gives us, helpfully, a little quotation from Callimachus. The oxen came under the plough willingly, which I think is to show the use of hupo with underneath. So hupo arotron, under the plough, is sort of making that same connection. But evidently, this little quotation of Callimachus is something that you would want to know if you were the type of educated person who was buying this commentary. Those of you who are familiar with Callimachus will know that his poetry is very elusive. It requires a lot of knowledge about other bits of Greek religion, Greek literature to sort of engage with fully. So Callimachus is very much not for the faint of heart among ancient readers. So just looking back at the image of the papyrus, then, I just want to show you that next to one another, side by side, we have this very short comment telling us about the use of the dative case with the river, followed by a much longer comment going into what is really very technical detail about the etymology of this word, as well as giving us a quotation of Callimachus for use in other things. Just to make the point that where we might think that pointing out that a dative case is equivalent to the preposition hupo plus the genitive case, we might think that that's pretty basic stuff, pretty elementary. And yet it's found in this high quality, full length commentary on papyrus right next to this much longer comment about etymology and quoting the poetry of Callimachus. Moving on from there, then, that sort of gives you a sense of the way these things stand in the sort of high imperial period. And as we move on from there, a couple of sort of important things happen. One is that for various reasons, there seems to have been a move towards more and more sort of compilation style commentaries, which combined the works of many people. The Venetus A, the manuscript we saw at the start, gets most of its information from a now lost commentary that has been dubbed the Viermänner Kommentar, the four-man commentary in German. It's a compilation of works by the scholars Didymus, Aristarchus, Herodian, and Nicanor, all of whom were active in the first century BC, the first century AD. We know this in the case of the Venetus A, thanks to this little bibliographical note, which is added to the end of each book of the Iliad. The form changes a little bit, but this one you can hopefully see has the names of Aristarchus, Didymus, and Nicanor. And not Herodian, just in this particular case, but Herodian is named in lots of the other notes. On the other side, the sort of explanatory side, the exegetical side, the same process was going on. These initial commentaries made by a single scholar became compilations, and those became compilations of compilations, and things get increasingly bundled and added together. Unfortunately, that also means that most of the names associated with those works and those compilations are lost. So the surviving exegetical, explanatory material is almost all anonymous. A huge amount of it is. And I want to focus on that anonymous exegetical stuff in this presentation. So we end up with these large multi-authored commentaries that bring a whole mass of scholarship right to your fingertips. And it goes without saying, this is just too much effort. Even this, 2 papyrus rolls, it's just far too cumbersome. Undergrads I teach have all told me how they've experienced this problem. They're sort of reading a big blue Cambridge commentary with one hand, holding that open. They're flipping through their text of the Iliad with another. They're making notes with a third hand, holding a cup of coffee with their fourth. There's just too much going on. And it presumably proved the same for ancient readers. So at some point, they start to put these comments into the margins of papyri. This had already been happening for short notes, a little bit like the note on potamoige that we previously saw. So it makes sort of good sense as a natural step. This, for instance, is a very famous papyrus of Homer. I used it on the title slide. It's called the Hawara Homer in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. It dates from the 2nd century AD. So a very early example of putting these notes in the margins. And you might just about be able to make out at the start of that small comment where you've got a word with what looks like an X above it. That is an abbreviation of Aristarchus's name. And that is, in fact, a little comment reporting one of Aristarchus's preferred textual variants for this particular line. I think it's in Iliad 2. So unfortunately, our evidence is the weakest at this point, from the 3rd century onwards. There are lots of theories for exactly how, why, and when these compiled commentaries became marginal notes. And in part, I think we can link this change to the rise of the codex. So before this point, papyrus was largely handled in rolls that would be unrolled. But in the 3rd century, increasingly the codex, which is a book like we would recognize, sort of sewn together at one end with a spine and pages that you can flick through. At that point, the codex begins to take over from rolls of papyrus, and there are lots of reasons for that, which we can get into if we want to. One particular advantage of the codex in this context is that each section of text which fits onto a single page has a clear amount of marginal space around the edge of it, which can be filled with notes. It's a little bit harder with papyrus rolls because the columns all run parallel to one another, so the margins sort of bleed into each other. This, as a sort of quick summary, more or less gets us from the destruction of Troy up to the Vanitas A in the 10th century and our surviving manuscripts. We have papyrus codices with marginal notes. Eventually, papyrus is replaced with parchment, and later on again by paper after our manuscripts. And that is the state in which our Scholia survive. There are, unfortunately, a lot of unanswered questions and a lot of mystery, especially on the exegetical side. Who wrote the original commentaries, or who had the original ideas? Who compiled and recompiled them? There's a question about whether a compilation was then copied straight into the margins, or whether somebody took a bunch of commentaries and compiled them as they put it into the margins. We just don't know for how long the Scholia, as they survive in the 10th century, were in something like the form they're in today. And unfortunately, it's just one of the big mysteries that we will probably never solve about antiquity. Such is the way of these things. Now, we've looked at the Vanitas A just briefly, but the exegetical scholia come from 2 main sources that I'll just point out. Over here in green, you have A for the Vanitas A. If you haven't seen one of these before, I should say, this is a manuscript stemma. Each of these letters represents a single manuscript. The ones in capitals survive, so A with superscript A, C, E3B, T, GE, LE. Those are all manuscripts that survive today, and we know what they contain. Anything that is a lowercase letter or a Greek letter, in the case of these three betas, is something which is lost. So the sort of lines between all the manuscripts indicate what was copied from what. Um, this is not perfect. There might be missing links in these chains that we don't know about, but you will be able to see from this that our two main sources for the exegetical material are these two groups in red. So a lost manuscript, lowercase b, spawns all of these five principal manuscripts, C, E3, B, star B, LE, and there are others as well. Those are all copies, descendants of lost manuscript B. And then there is also manuscript T, the Tauliensis, and both B and T are copies of lost manuscript C, although B and T often copy things in quite different ways. T often gives us fuller versions, longer versions of the same comments. So, just to sum up, sort of as we start thinking about the BT Scholia, the sort of original moment of idea having, the original genesis of the content of these scholia that we're about to read, probably dates to the first 2 centuries AD. And then there's a whole squiggly process of compilation and copying, and they end up in Byzantine manuscripts in sort of the first few years, the first couple of centuries after the year 1000. So any given manuscript that we find might be under 1,000 years old, but the ideas and the approaches to the Iliad, which they contain, are more like 2,000 years old. And I know what you'll all be thinking. I'm an enthusiastic classicist. I read my Boudet editions before I go to bed, and I don't have anything to learn from outdated ancient commentaries. And you might be right. But what is most valuable, I've found in my research on the Scholia, is not necessarily the actual content, but they are very useful in how they approach Homer. They have a radically different perspective to us modern readers, and they can prevent you from approaching every part of the poem in the same way. So I sort of will try and challenge you for the rest of this presentation to think not about the Scholia as an authoritative source on the poetry of Homer, but rather to treat them like you might treat other research scholarship today. We can and should criticize their conclusions, but their methods could well be worth adding to our own arsenal of tools. So let's get into some of the detail. We're first going to consider Iliad Book 6. This is the famous scene with Hector and Andromache on the tower, by the tower of Troy. Just before this, Hector has met two other women. He has instructed his mother, Hecabe, to go make a sacrifice or go and pray to Athena and dedicate a lovely robe to try and placate the goddess. And he's also spoken to Helen so that she can try and convince Paris to return to battle. He then goes to his own house and he speaks to the housekeeper, whose speech is here on this slide. He asks her where his wife has gone, and it's revealed that she didn't go anywhere that you might expect a Trojan noblewoman to be, with her sisters-in-laws, but in fact she is on the Tower of Troy. Hector heads towards the Scaean Gates, which is the name of one of the principal gates of the city, and there he encounters Andromache. You can see the meeting of the two in the second half of the bit on the slide here. So the question is, why does Andromache go out to the tower? Personally, I would be tempted, in sort of modern sensibilities, to answer something like the two of them meet by the Scaean Gates, which is the intersection between the city and the battlefield. It perhaps represents the meeting of the military and domestic spheres that they both belong to. The scene between them continues to play out that tension between the roles, and there's the tragic, sort of irreconcilable gap between even the loving husband and his wife due to the pressures on Hector. The scene affects us on an emotional level, and it looks ahead to Hector's inevitable death, which Andromache foretells. You might also even say that the mention of the tower and the various aspects of the scene look ahead to their son Astyanax's death during the later sack of Troy, which even Hector fails to consider when he talks about how the city would fall. That might be a sort of modern interpretation. Some of the themes and reasons we might draw out the importance of this particular meeting point and why Andromache goes here. Now, one scholion, which I will briefly show you, does present this kind of analysis. Why does Andromache go out? Well, it says that Homer, since he's just had two scenes where Hector has gone to somebody's house and he's found the woman he's looking for, first his mother and then Helen, Homer is avoiding something which is the same, a scene of the same type, by depicting Andromache not being found within the house. And at the same time, he sort of leaves it up to us, the listener, to judge how sad Hector will be at this, given that he has found Hecate and Helen, but he hasn't found his dear wife. She had gone away, and he meets her later against his better judgment. So this, I think, is a sort of relatively familiar type of analysis. Why does Andromache go out to the wall? Well, she basically goes out because it suits Homer's purposes. It creates a useful scene in an emotional response in the reader. It creates a good plot moment, and it sort of keeps the poem from becoming monotonous. But even in this, you will see that the Scholion does consider Andromache to be almost like a real person with real emotions. She is downcast, katerphes is the Greek term, and she hasn't taken her closest people along with her. Presumably that would be anybody except the nurse who comes with them. So she hasn't taken any of her sisters or any of her other relatives. She has gone just with the child and a nurse for the child. To compare that, I have another scholion for you on this scene. Again, where his wife of great dowry is the quote from the text. And this scholion instead offers us the explanation that she went up onto the wall so that she could see Hector. But since he was seen nowhere, she is returning home and seeing him about to go out, runs up to him so that he should not pass her by first. This is, I think, quite different to the previous scholion in some ways, because it's really giving us a psychological beat-by-beat analysis of how Andromache acts here, even though none of this is narrated in the text of Homer itself. We never find out in Homer why she went up to the wall, so the scholion fills in that gap. She was looking for Hector, and we never find out why she decides to return. It's because she can't see him on the battlefield. We never find out why she is running up to him. Well, the scholion again can fill it in. Actually, it was just good luck that this is the point at which Hector is about to go out onto the plain. It just so happens that that's the point that Andromache has given up on the tower and is on her way back home. They happen to be going by the same route, so she runs up to him so that she can catch him before he goes out to the battle. Now, we find all of this all through the Scholia, based on the sort of research that I've done and I'm still doing. Individual Scholia are much, much more likely to attribute events in the narrative to characters' psychological states than to the poet's planning. The first Scholion we saw about the way the scene suits Homer's purposes is in the minority in that sense. And this, I think, is quite different to our modern approach to Homer. Characterization and the personality of characters really sort of takes a back seat to narrative structure and our consideration of plot, thematic unity, and things like that. But reading the Scholia, I think, opens us up to the possibility that we should be taking Homer just as seriously in his ability to create realistic characters as we are in his ability to create an intricate and meaningful narrative. If we trust Homer to create such a great, intricately woven plot and thematic structure, why should we not trust him to create characters that behave like real people? Now, similar ideas apply to the analysis of character speeches. I personally find it easy to read much of the speech in Homer as quite conventional, to skip over what seems like formula and value the overall message of the speech more than the particular way it's conveyed. A lot can seem like just sort of filler or politeness, I suppose. And here again, I think the Scholia provide a useful counterbalance to maybe not a modern tendency, maybe it's just me being lazy, but a modern tendency, even if it's just mine. So I mentioned earlier that rhetoric is the sole focus, pretty much, of the highest levels of ancient education. So it's not really a surprise that there was a lot of appetite for information about the rhetoric in Homer. You can even get into there are sort of whole theories that Homer basically invented all of the rhetoric that would be used later on in antiquity, that it's all already there in Homer. You just got to go and look for it. So for an example of this, I'm going to turn to Nestor's speech in Book 7 of the Iliad. Now, I know this is a real highlight of the poem. I'm sure we're all familiar with it. No recap is necessary. But here is one just in case. So Hector calls a duel. Nobody accepts the offer. Menelaus rebukes the Achaeans and begins to arm himself to take on Hector. Agamemnon dissuades him so that he's not killed by Hector and says that even Achilles would try to avoid facing Hector. Then Nestor stands up and he gives this speech. He rebukes the Achaeans and he says that Peleus, who is Achilles' father, would be ashamed if he knew how cowardly they were being. And then Nestor goes on to tell the story of when he defeated Eruthalion, an Arcadian warrior who he went on to kill. Nestor has a habit of breaking into stories throughout the poem about his past exploits, and our typical, again, our sort of modern way of analyzing these speeches might be, for instance, that this is one way the poet can bring in other mythical traditions, in the same way that the speech of the old man Phoenix in Book 9 tells us the story of Meleager and the aftermath of the boar hunt that he was involved in. What this story contributes to the actual discussion going on between the characters, I think, is easily missed, especially in some of these sort of shorter, lesser known cases like this. So in the first place, there is a question of why Nestor should speak at all when we're dealing with a duel that he is obviously not going to fight. This scholion here, the first one that we'll look at, argues that Agamemnon failed to persuade them with a relatively oblique point that, that to say why they should fight. And so somebody else needs to come in. Agamemnon, in the last sentence of the Scholia here, Agamemnon failed, so we need somebody else to take a different approach. So it makes sense. It's plausible, in the words of the Scholia, Pythagoras, it sort of bears credibility, that Nestor should chastise them, since as an old man, nobody expects him to duel against Hector, and so nobody is going to tell him he's a hypocrite or tell him that he is being a coward. Instead, he actually has free rein to chastise all the others and tell them that they should be fighting. So he can sort of do full-throated criticism. A quick look just at some of the content of the speech, just to give you a sense of it. Nestor says that Peleus, the father of Achilles, would be so upset by the Greek cowardice that he would pray to be swallowed by the earth. And that's a prayer that is familiar from other bits of Homer. It might seem a little bland to just invoke Peleus, who has no personal relationship to a lot of the Greeks. But this longer scholion, I think, makes a really interesting point. It first says that just in general, we should honor our elders, such as the elderly Peleus. And then some people say that this is a bad speech by Nestor because, and we should say that at this point, Achilles has left the war effort temporarily. He is raging. He is staying in his tent. He is not helping the Greeks in this fight. And the Scholion wants to cast this as Nestor and the Greeks thinking of Achilles at this moment as their enemy, as somebody who is hostile to them. Uh, so the Scholion says that there are certain critics who say that Homer has done badly in this passage because it doesn't make sense to talk about Peleus, given that he's not related to most of the Greeks. The Scholion counters, actually, this is a good bit of rhetoric. For if the father of the enemy, which is how we're temporarily thinking of Achilles, is downcast, how much more are our parents downcast? If even Achilles' father is upset at how badly the Greeks are doing, when we're thinking that Peleus would want the Greeks to fail due to their dishonoring of Achilles, you can only imagine how upset the Greeks' own parents would be. And there's also a point here about subtly Nestor is mentioning Achilles by bringing up Peleus, and therefore sort of obliquely getting round to telling Agamemnon that he needs to reconcile with Achilles and that they need him. From here, Nestor moves on to the story about the duel he fought against this warrior Ereuthalion. This next Scholia again talks about the rhetorical usefulness of this. Nestor is not just telling the story for the sake of it, but in fact, he, as we know, is excused from the charge of hypocrisy as an old man. But his criticism can still be considered to hold little weight unless he can prove that in an equivalent situation in the past, he acted in the right way. And the Scholion tells us that the story he tells proves just that. In fact, by sort of narrating some of his deeds, murdering this warrior Ereuthalion, Nestor builds up the cred that he needs in order to tell all the rest of the Greeks that they should be fighting and shouldn't be cowards, because Nestor in the past was not a coward. Now, these are the ones we've seen, 3 of 15 different notes analyzing Nestor's rhetorical effectiveness in this speech of only 37 lines. So, approximately a scholion every other line. This is not confined, this sort of level of detail, to this speech or even to the speeches of Nestor. Other speeches that receive a lot of attention for their rhetorical effectiveness include the appeal of Thetis to Zeus in Book 1, Odysseus's speech after the near rout in Book 2, this sort of near catastrophe, and the appeals of Athena and Hera to Zeus at the start of Book 4 before the breaking of the truce, as well as various others. So throughout the poem, points that were seen to be sort of rhetorical high watermarks are really focused on by the Scholia and used to provide good examples of how to do rhetoric well. Okay, we're going to take a little bit of a different tack again, and you'll sort of see where we're going with this. We're going to look at bias in the Scholia. You might know that it was more common in the ancient world to see Homer as pro-Greek in his telling of the poem, and various scholia explicitly subscribe to this and show their own biases through that. And there's sort of a few interesting scholia as well that delve into some sort of ways that Homer shows that he's pro-Greek and when he doesn't. And there's sort of their bias in that, and we'll also see some misogynistic scholia as well, playing into another kind of bias. So we'll start with the Philhellenism of Homer. To set the scene, it's Book 8. The gods at the moment can't intervene, and the Achaeans are in a pretty bad spot. At this point, only the fall of night seems to stop the Trojan advance. And here, this is just a side point. This is a card from the Liebig Meat Extract Company. They would do sort of themed series of cards. This is their Trojan War one. Sorry for the low resolution image. All sorts of different scenes from the Iliad and the general Trojan War that you might recognize here. And you can see, I think, the fellow with his sword is supposed to be Hector, getting ready to smash down the gate to the Greek camp. So we've had sort of various things going on. The Achaeans are currently hemmed in at their wall, and Hera has twice failed to intervene on their behalf. The only thing she's managed to do really is to get Agamemnon to give a speech. Night falls, the Trojans make camps near the ship, and Hector gives a speech saying that they're going to burn the ships tomorrow. The first Scholion tells us about the intervention of Hera. The poet here keeps us in suspense by moving away from the battle up to the divine realm and telling us what Hera is up to. She's currently pitying the Greeks. This keeps us in suspense because Homer is not narrating the misfortune of the Greeks, i.e., we're sort of not sure which way the situation is going to go because Homer has moved away from narrating it. And the reason that he doesn't want to tell us about how badly it's going for the Greeks is that he is himself pro-Greek. So he feels bad. He doesn't enjoy narrating Greek misfortune. It's a clever move, the Scholion tells us, because Homer doesn't need to tell us exactly how it's going badly for the Greeks. He doesn't need to kill off any of his key characters, perhaps. And he does this not because it would be tedious, because we've had enough of this scene, but as I say, because he himself doesn't like narrating this. And then these two scholia both pertain to Hector's speech at the end of the day. He says they're going to drive the Achaeans out so that even another might shudder to bring war to the Trojans. It says that the speech contains barbarian boastfulness. Alasdoneia is boastfulness is the Greek word. Hector, unlike Nestor, who we just saw, his speaking does not lend him credibility. It does not sort of encourage people, but it's too much. It's over the top. And similarly, Hector makes a point. It's not quoted very clearly here, but he says something along the lines of, it's actually a little bit disputed, the Greek. It's a little bit sort of hard to understand. Something along the lines of, I wish I was as certain of being immortal as I am that tomorrow will bring disaster to the Achaeans. Um, the Scholion quotes this a little bit out of context and says, if only I were immortal, and comments that it is barbaric to pray for impossible things. I'll just note here that in Nestor's speech that we looked at, he starts it by saying, how I wish I was young again. And that attracts no such comment from the Scholia. Their own sort of particular bias is especially clear, I think, at this point. Okay. The pivot I want to take to look at some of the misogyny that appears in the Scholia is related to this scene at the end of Book 1 of the Iliad, where Thetis appeals to Zeus, and Hera, who you can see on a little cloud in the background, is not happy about it and takes him to task. There, in the bibliography, there's an excellent article by Irina de Jong on more examples of misogyny in the Scholia, if you're interested. So Hera comes up to Zeus and asks what Thetis was talking about and says what he's up to. And Zeus says to Thetis that Hera is outdoors unceasingly rebuking me among the immortal gods and says that I assist the Trojans in battle. We would say outdoors is unceasingly. The Scholia glosses it a little differently. Outdoors as matern, in vain or falsely, with it not being true that I am actually assisting them. And the Scholia tells us charmingly that Homer completely lays out the feminine character, for they suspect everything and they chastise their husbands as not doing things which are pleasing to them. Sorry, typo there, I should say pleasing. They similarly, in another further two examples from when Hera is actually speaking a little bit later on, tell us sort of the way women are in the Scholia's terms. So they get annoyed if their husbands don't share everything. And they say that it is customary for women to deny that they annoy their husbands. And the verb here, parenokleor, is to do with sort of crowding somebody, annoying them by sort of pressing on them and over busying them. And finally, just to note, this is an example of the poet teaching us something. This is a theme that recurs again and again throughout the Scholia, the idea that Homer is an educator. But here, the message that the Scholia draw from the poem is that perhaps a woman would be unbearable if she weren't threatened. So that perhaps in the ancient imagination, this interaction between Zeus and Hera is a model for how you should treat your wife, and you should sort of keep her in check through threats. Again, needless to say, this reflects the perspective, I argue, of the people who originally had these ideas in the first few centuries AD. And it's worth us noting, therefore, that this is one frame through which people would have seen this interaction between Zeus and Hera. The various points in the poem where Zeus threatens Hera, for instance, reminds her of the time that that he threw her down out of Olympus. Um, presumably there were readers saying, "Absolutely, Zeus, right on. You've got the right idea doing that." Okay, so where does this all lead? And I'm not saying that we should adopt these misogynistic or pro-Greek to the exclusion of Trojan praise approaches when we read Homer. It's rather a reminder that not everybody who reads or has read Homer approaches it from our perspective and with the biases that we hold. It's a worthwhile exercise to consider how others, in this case, the writers of exegetical commentaries in the Roman period, might experience Homer's poetry. And in fact, the Scholia engage in some of this as well, considering what the experience of Homer might have been like for others. You may be surprised to hear, but whenever it comes up, they are clear that the Iliad is intended to be heard aloud by an audience. And this is just the final category of Scholia that I just want to quickly display to you, the ones that talk about how the audience is affected and using that as a way to analyze certain elements of the poem. So here, uh, from Iliad 5, we have the two the two Ajaxes, Odysseus and Diomedes, mentioned. And this makes us, this Scholion tells us that the audience here, the listeners, are going to feel good towards the Greeks because the gods are not helping them at this point. We are sort of, currently in the plot, Ares is helping the Trojans, and in about 200 more lines from this point, Athena will descend and help Diomedes defeat Ares. This is sort of fairly familiar critical territory from today, perhaps. There are certainly characters that we sympathize with. We could bring up Priam and Achilles in Iliad 24. You might consider the moment when Menelaus is shot in Book 4. We might feel sympathy for Agamemnon as the worried brother there. But I think what's maybe unexpected is that the listener's goodwill here is explicitly connected to the gods rather than, for instance, mortal casualties. The upcoming slaying of Tlepolemus by Sarpedon, for instance. The lack of divine help will result in those casualties, of course, but it's the juxtaposition of the four heroes versus the god Ares that is really affecting the reader rather than any of those consequences. Oops. More unusual is this scholion from Book 2. This is just ahead of the catalogue of ships, which you will all know is not the most thrilling bit to read. And, oh, sorry, I hope I haven't done anything there. The catalogue could be said, according to the scholion, to be lacking in a particular way. The poet, Homer, guards against this by invoking the muses, going through the prayer about how the muses need to help him with the catalogue of ships makes the reader more interested, says that this causes the reader to be excited to learn about what's going on. And I think it's okay. As a way to explain the second invocation of the muses, the idea that you're building up what you're about to do to make it more exciting for the listeners, I think is all right. But what's particularly interesting here is the fact that the Scholion also says that Homer, by being humble, by saying that he needs the help of the muses and that he can't do this on his own, this also attracts goodwill from the listeners. There is a sense that there needs to be a good social relationship between the poet and his audience when he is performing. And we can think about sort of later performance culture of Homer that we know about if we want to compare that. Uh, just the last scholium that I want to talk about then is this one from Iliad 6. Glaucus and Diomedes have met on the battlefield. It's interesting. I will just note that they have this long conversation about their lineages and their histories, and they go on to exchange gifts while we presume the action carries on around them. This scholion actually tells us that Homer, as well as giving the reader a break from battles by doing interesting things like genealogies and myths, he has the army. The armies also take a rest. It's the same verb. The reader gets a rest and the army gets a rest, presumably just sort of parting and leaving Diomedes and Glaucus to have their conversation before the battle carries on. And I think there is therefore this idea that the poet speeds the narration up or slows the narration down depending on what's going on. But there are some things that have to be explained. So here, Diomedes and Glaucus stepping forward to meet each other is a necessity. Uh, and this, I think, as well as sort of thinking about the variation for the reader, for the audience, the sort of the listener, also suggests that the listener is listening to these things in long stretches. They are aware that actually the audience needs to have different things coming together because they're going to be listening to this for a long time. I mean, the idea of us listening to the entire Iliad would take the best part of a day. You absolutely do need breaks. We get this idea as well in other bits. So the return of Chryse, the kidnapped girl in Book 1, the burial of the Achaean dead in Iliad Book 7, and the construction of the Achaeans' wall are all said to be rests for the audience, a change of pace, something else. We are, according to the Scholia, interspersing one sort of type of narration with another, avoiding things being monotonous. And we can sort of note that that's not an option for the catalogue of ships. You have to go through the catalogue. And therefore, the poet uses a different device altogether, this invocation of the muses, to make sure that the experience for the listener is pleasant. I think it's interesting, therefore, that in contrast maybe to most modern approaches, which look for things like type scenes that are repeated through the play, how something early on is picked up by something later, they are doing something very different to the Scholia, where the Scholia here are at least attempting to consider what it might be like to hear the Iliad as a continuous performance, what the effect of that might be on the listeners. And I think there are certainly worse ways to consider the effect of it as an oral poem than that. That brings me to my conclusion, a little over time, sorry about that. But let me sum up. I am sort of glad to say that you now know a lot more about Scholia than even the majority of professional classicists. I'm sorry to say they're still quite an obscure area. I started this lecture telling you a little bit about their history, as well as their relationship to ancient commentaries like the papyrus we saw, which came from Oxyrhynchus. We've read quite a few Scholia, and I hope you've seen that there's often quite a lot of thought going on under the surface of what is quite difficult Greek a lot of the time, quite compressed and quite hard to understand. If you want to read more, the bibliography is coming at the end, and I would recommend starting with Eleanor Dickey's book on how to read and approach Greek scholarship. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Scholia have everything right. Even when we take out the misogyny, the pro-Greek bias, and so on, they say plenty of things which I think are incorrect or which misunderstand bits of the Iliad. But what I hope to have shown you, however, is that they can offer a relatively straightforward insight into how ancient readers in the early centuries BC did read the Iliad. In some respects, I think our analysis of the Iliad is greatly developed by today. We know a lot more about the techniques behind oral poetry. We have better tools for quantitative analysis and for identifying recurring phrases. We know a lot more about the linguistics behind the language of the poem, and we have archaeological evidence that relate to Bronze Age warfare and cities. However, these advances can obscure our view of some poetic elements. To take an early example, it's very hard for us to ask why a character performs a certain action without referring to the poet's stylistic or narrative goals. We have to sort of talk ourselves into these questions of psychology and motivation. So I hope out of everything that we've seen, I've left you with some real sort of alternative approaches to the Iliad. Uh, characterization and psychology, the idea that we can take rhetoric seriously and deal with it properly as an exercise in detailed persuasion, with the example of Nestor, and that we can consider the ancient audience's biases in our analysis, as well as considering seriously the flow of the oral, whether you spell it AU or O, the flow of that experience on the listener. We come to the Iliad with very different ideas to ancient critics, and that's no surprise. But just as you might with some wacky scholarship today, you may yet find some unexpected gems hidden in these margins. Thank you very much, and I'll be delighted to take any questions.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm going to stop the recording here and then we'll open it up to questions.
Great.
And then anyone who's watching this later is also welcome to post any questions.